It's a Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. Thank you for your presence. That is more of an achievement, at least speaking personally for myself, to get here. And we welcome those who are joining us remotely. This is, as David indicated, day 3 of Notre Dame's Conference on Accountability, Healing, and Trust. This morning's panel is on lessons from fellow Christians for ministry in the church. We have 3 speakers who will be speaking 15 to 20 minutes each. I'll be introducing each, and then at the end, we'll have a discussion period for the time that remains, hopefully 15 to 20 minutes for that discussion period. Our first speaker will be speaking, joining us remotely. She is Elizabeth Rain Kincaid, who is Assistant Professor of Ethics and Moral Theology at Nashotah House Theological Seminary. Her research interests include Thomistic virtue ethics, natural law, Catholic social teaching, work and vocation, and the Spanish scholastics. Dr. Kincaid is especially excited about exploring the relationship between law, business ethics, and moral theology, as well as connecting moral theology to on-the-ground challenges in parishes and professional settings. Her current projects include a monograph retrieving Francisco Suarez Eche's Theological Jurisprudence, and a textbook on virtue and professional ethics. Dr. Kincaid's ecclesial involvement includes service on the local and national level. During her doctoral studies at the University of Notre Dame, she was selected as an Episcopal Church Foundation Fellow. She currently serves as the Vice President of the Corporation of the Anglican Theological Review. She has written popular articles and blog posts for publications such as The Living Church, Christianity Today, and America Magazine. She is a frequent speaker at academic conferences and ecclesial events. Dr. Kincaid grew up in Dallas, Texas. Before beginning her studies in theology, she practiced law, worked in private equity, and served as a campus minister for graduate students. Join me in welcoming Dr. Kincaid.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fitzgerald, for that introduction. And thank you, David and Kim, for organizing this conference and inviting me to be a part of it. I'm just sad that some family commitments kept me from being present in person with you all. But look forward to our discussion. And it's always fun to be on a panel with friends, even if we are Zoom friends at this, or Zoom co-panelists at this point. So as I was thinking about my talks for this panel, I found it somewhat challenging to think about what lessons from the Episcopal Church or the Anglican world might be relevant to the Roman Catholic Church. And that's because in many ways, our situations are very similar as far as the sex abuse crisis and the impact on the church. I would say there are more similarities than differences, which perhaps not all of my colleagues in the Anglican world would agree with. And my conclusion about this is based on my own experience as a working on the diocesan level and a very limited role as a assistant chancellor. That's one of the assistant attorneys for the diocese. Conversations I have had with other chancellors, other assistant chancellors, with priests and with bishops, as well as some outside resource. So a lot of what I'm sharing is anecdotal, received wisdom, but perhaps that actually points to one of the big differences between the Episcopal Church and the Roman Catholic Church is that our struggles have not been as well researched and well documented, even though I would argue they are equally real. So to look back, to provide a little perspective, we need to look back to the 1990s when the sex abuse crisis was gaining publicity, gaining steam. And just as the Roman Catholic Church, kind of greater publicity, greater awareness arose around the sex abuse crisis, the same thing was happening in the National Episcopal Church. There was a greater awareness both of a problem and of the problems related to these solutions. And these solutions, which had been largely adopted at that time, and I would say this is true most likely across both more of the progressive diocese and more of the traditional diocese was a lack of understanding of the problem, a lack of awareness and sensitivity to victims' needs, and a great fear of scandal and a desire to protect the church. So both the Episcopal Church, like the Roman Catholic Church, was in the situation of being a hierarchical church that had both national and local canon law that was governed by bishops with priests serving in priestly ministry that had a great deal at that point of national significance and prominence and was then a much larger denomination than it is now, a significant amount of resources, similar understandings, and a similar approach, with the priority being preventing scandal. So this resulted in priests that had a history of abuse being moved around between dioceses and a lot of out-of-court settlements in response to abuse. In fact, the situations were so similar that in several dioceses, the Roman Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church set up joint legal defense teams. So there was a lot of connection and in realizing the problem, realizing the failed solutions to the problem, and sort of process moving forward. So what has happened from 1990? What has happened differently? Well, in a lot of ways, the similarities have continued. The National Episcopal Church adopted a canon, for ecclesial discipline, which is very similar to the Roman Catholic canon. It's called Title IV, which is the large ecclesiastical discipline canon, and it includes offenses related to sex abuse. And so this was sort of seen as the solution. The difference is that there was a lot less publicity around the Episcopal Church. It is a smaller church, even then it was a smaller church. It does not seem that perhaps the problem, again, I'm not sure because there was less publicity, but there was not as much of a focus on worldwide issues around the Anglican communion with sex abuse. It really came out more in the US and Canada. And so what the National Episcopal Church ended up with was an awareness that there was a problem, an awareness of the danger, an awareness that the solutions weren't adequate, and a canon law solution that looks very similar to that employed by the Roman Catholic Church. Along with the lack of sort of the high level of publicity, the other difference that occurred in the National Episcopal Church is that in the 2000s, there were a number of very significant church splits. The conservative wing of the denomination broke off and founded some what we call continuing Anglican denominations. These are the Anglican Church of North America, the Anglican Mission in America, that have a connection to they're not official members of the Worldwide Anglican Communion. They have an official connection through the African bishops who sponsored them as missionary dioceses in the United States. And when the continuing Anglican churches broke off, they took largely, not completely, but a lot of the canon law structure that was in the Episcopal Church. So they took their own version of Title IV. So in the 2000s and up to the present day, the focus internally in the Episcopal Church, and then again, kind of broader Anglicanism, has been more focused on these splits, these intra-ecclesial issues. And there's been less, I would say, church-wide dialogue about the sex abuse crisis, specifically, again, once the canon law provisions were in place. So what's happened as a result of this split? And I guess what would be lessons for the Roman Catholic Church? Putting aside, of course, the lesson that splits make it harder to confront challenges together and are usually not a great thing for working to improve processes within your church. It's consumed on our side a lot of time and energy. And I say this, blame apportioned equally in financial resources, emotional resources, theological resources that could have perhaps been more productively used elsewhere. So across the sort of American Anglican world, I would say the good results are a general, very high level of clerical and lay rejection of the idea that protecting the church from scandal is the highest good, a fairly standardized process of clerical and lay education about preventing sex abuse. It's not great, but it does seem to be generally established that this is what you do to serve in a church. Or in my case, I teach in a seminary that's actually a diocesan seminary of both the ACNA, or recognized by both the ACNA and the Episcopal Church. And we are able to offer the same educational program about this to people from both the denominations. So it seems like there's a acceptance across the board of the importance of this education. And like I said, a rejection of the scandal avoidance approach, ironically, considering how much scandal has been occasioned by lawsuits between the two groups about property and the split. On the Episcopal Church side, some problems. The canons, the canonical discipline process is very complex. There are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of people. There are a lot of parties involved. The good thing about this is that it results in a very, very thorough investigation and make sure that the power is not all just in the bishop's hands to remove the temptation to sort of move the problematic priest away, shove the issue under the carpet. But this can make it unwieldy. This can make for a long process. This can make for a situation in which victims feel that their voices are not being heard. On the clerical side, there's no reputation protection clause, which is different from the Roman Catholic Church. So there's no guarantee of privacy prior to an investigation, which cuts down on incentives for priests to self-report or for people to kind of report across relationship barriers. And so this can result in probably a thorough process, but a complicated process that can be hard to negotiate for people in trauma. While I said that there is a high clerical and lay awareness of the importance of education and the danger, there is also a sense of this wasn't us. This was the Roman Catholics. This was their problem. And perhaps people who have not, sat on these diocesan panels or seen the documents, there can be a lack of awareness that this problem was in our parishes and our pews as well, and continues to be. And so this can lead to sort of a check the box attitude and a complacency approach. In addition, on the Episcopal Church side, as the church in the last 20 years has shifted to a greater emphasis on social justice concerns, this can also heighten that sense of complacency. We're the good guys. We're on the right side of history. We could never have perpetrators in our midst or allow perpetrators to continue in their patterns. So I think that would be the greatest danger I see on the Episcopal Church side. And perhaps speaking of lessons for the Roman Catholic Church side, how quickly and easily people can become complacent, even when they're aware that on some level that there's a big problem out there and can other the problem, say it's not us, it was the Roman Catholics. On the continuing church side, while the ACNA, the Anglican Church of North America, adopted largely the canons from the Episcopal Church, they are in a situation as a new denomination where they have significantly fewer resources than the National Episcopal Church. Not as many churches who had the large endowments left or were able to take their endowments. They have less experience in setting, and they've been over the last 15 years building their own bureaucratic structure. And so they don't have the resources, both in institutional memory and financially, that the National Episcopal Church side has. And while on the National Episcopal Church side, there can be the challenge of a sort of complacency related to the social justice movement. This can't be us. On the continuing Anglican side, there can be a complacency and perhaps a Puritan spirit related to their focus and convictions that they are the ones who have the pure doctrine, who broke away from the theologically problematic church. And again, there can be assumption, this isn't us, this couldn't happen to us, and a complacency and lack of awareness. There's a situation going on right now in the Anglican Diocese, I think it's of the Midwest, in Chicago, around discovery of a lay volunteer who was a child sex abuser who had been allowed to work in the churches and had kind of gotten around the safeguarding. And I would, again, not being on the inside of that, but as an outside observer, that perhaps part of the problem was a complacency that someone who was working for them wouldn't engage in these types of activities, and a lack of awareness about the potential danger of the problem. So just to wrap up, lessons. First lesson, it's not just y'all, it was us too. And that having these discussions across denominational boundaries, I know there's a lot of places they're going on, but it is very important. And the approach of pooling understanding is very important because it's not just one church's problem. Secondly, I would say that lay emphasis on, this is where I do think the Anglican world has done well, the emphasis on basic standards of lay education and training, a rejection of the mindset that the church is called to avoid scandal at all cost, are very positive. And that is what the good things I see in the Anglican world. And then an awareness of the danger of complacency and how quickly people can move, even with this education and awareness, people can move to a place of thinking for, whatever reason, we're the virtuous ones, we're the pure ones, and this can never happen to us. It just happens to other people. So look, those are my brief thoughts on this question. I look forward to our discussion and hearing from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kincaid. Our second speaker is here with us today. She is Hilary Jerome Scarsella, who is Assistant Professor of Ethics and Director of Women and Gender Studies in Church and Society at Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School and Director of Theological Integrity at Into Account. She is a scholar, speaker, and advocate with expertise in trauma, theology, ethics, religious practice, and policies relevant to sexual violence. She is committed to an intersectional approach to resisting sexual violence, one that centers racial justice. Her work at Into Account focuses on direct partnership with and advocacy for survivors. She is the primary point person on the Into Account team for assessing the implicit and explicit theological dimensions of community practices, policies, social patterns, modes of communication, and so forth, so that the religious dimensions of survivors' experiences can be named, validated, and addressed in communities that produce them. In addition to working directly with survivors, Hilary develops resources to support high-quality theological education on the subject of sexual violence. As a part of that work, she consults with religious leaders and communities who want to develop a culture that is more trauma-informed, mindful of sexualized violence survivors who are members of the community, and wise with respect to members who are perpetrators. Dr. Scarsella.
I am so glad. Is this working? Yeah. I am so glad to be having this conversation with all of you people who are wonderful and here today. The collective work to address sexual abuse in the church that's represented by the people gathered here in the room and also online is enormous. And I'm grateful for every bit of what each of you are contributing. I want to recognize in particular all of the energy and knowledge that survivors participating in this conference and elsewhere have put into making our communities safer. Survivors are the reason any progress has been made on this issue at all. And you deserve your community's profound respect and gratitude. So thank you, and could we please clap? I also want to thank my colleagues at Into Account who are not here today, but whose wisdom and expertise have hugely contributed to what I'm going to offer. They are Dr. Stephanie Krabel, Jay Yoder, and Aaron Bergen. So there were two questions that were posed to our panel for reflection, and I think that they're great questions. So I'm going to do my best to speak plainly and engage them as transparently as I can. And when I state the questions, I think you'll see that Dr. Kincaid did so as well. The first question posed to us was, what does clergy sexual abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church look like from the perspective of other Christian denominations? And the second, what are the distinctive challenges that have arisen in the Christian churches to address sexual abuse, and how are these communities meeting those challenges? As I respond, I'm speaking as a person raised in Anabaptist traditions of peace and nonviolence, traditions that themselves are rife with sexual violence. I am the granddaughter of devout Italian Catholics. I am a survivor. I teach theology and ethics at a historically Baptist seminary. I'm a professional advocate for survivors of sexual violence across the gamut of Christian contexts, so Catholic, Protestant, Anabaptist, evangelical, conservative, and progressive. My organization, Into Account, is the organization that has advocated for survivors of sacred music composer David Haas, which may be familiar, especially to this audience. So I come with these contexts and vantage points as those from which I have considered what the clergy sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church looks like. To be honest with you, it doesn't look good. I want to qualify that the comments I'm about to make are made, of course, by someone who is an outsider. And I'm also making them at a bird's eye view. I'm talking about what the crisis looks like for folks who aren't well connected in Catholic circles, who aren't necessarily exposed to the specific initiatives to address abuse within Catholic spaces, like many we've been discussing throughout this conference. I have in mind Catholic US America as a whole, the impression this wide landscape gives to those who are just peeking in for a moment, and most especially to those peeking in while advocating for survivors. Another way to put it is that I'm not necessarily talking about the smaller cross-section of Catholic life represented by the people and initiatives who decided to gather here for this conversation. That said, it has been 20 years since the beginning of Boston Globe's reporting, 20 years since concrete evidence of the systemic problem of clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic Church became widespread knowledge. 20 years since the wider church has had opportunity to organize for theological, relational, and structural change. A whole generation of people has grown from infant to adult since then, and the scale of the problem remains staggering. Clergy abuse of children, clergy abuse of adults, also hugely problematic and connected, lay leaders abuse of children and adults as well. This is a conference on clergy sexual abuse, but abuse in the church perpetrated by lay leaders can't be entirely separated out. These problems are systemic and related. Of course, change takes time. Dr. Kim Belcher spoke last evening very well about the generational nature of trauma, the way crises built through decades take decades to address, and she's absolutely right. It is good that those of us here are committed for the long haul and caring for our souls along the way, because change takes time. What I find concerning, however, is that huge portions of the Catholic Church seem okay with that. Okay with progress that is partial and slow. Not okay as in accepting of the fact of human limitation, but okay like resistant to or resentful of the sense of urgency that survivors bring to the table. As I have worked with survivors of David Haas's abuses, I have experienced a distinct lack of urgency and resistance to urgency on the part of many Catholic leaders and structures across the country. And this resistance in many cases is strategic. For example, I have watched certain groups choose not to speak about Haas's abuses out of fear that doing so would gather attention to the abuses happening in their own youth programs. This too is a cover-up. Change takes time, and change in the Catholic Church does not need to take this much time. There will always be more research to do, but the church has all of the information and evidence it needs for change. The church has access to all of the necessary resources it needs for change. They exist, they are out there. And both clergy and lay cover-ups are still happening regularly. And notice I didn't say clergy and lay abuse because, of course, clergy and lay cover-ups are happening regularly, unabashedly even. So change takes time, and we shouldn't be okay with that. Until religious and lay leaders and entire Catholic communities are consistently treating the problem of sexual violence with a level of urgency that matches the intensity of survivors' wisdom and perseverance and gifts of prophetic witness, the state of the Catholic sexual abuse crisis will look to those in positions like mine, like an ongoing betrayal of survivors, continuing to unfold in real time. How else does the sexual abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church look from the place where I stand? It looks preventable, even though it's still happening. It looks, and I say this gently, a little naive, because sanctioning the most easily identifiable and obviously accountable perpetrators in the church, clergy who have been shown to have abused multiple children, is not anywhere near enough to dismantle a culture of abuse and enablement entrenched through the entire ecclesial, theological, spiritual, and relational system. And that's what you're up against. It looks underfunded and undervalued. My colleagues who run survivor-centered organizations and projects that have been indispensable and will be going into the future indispensable for the Catholic Church's progress in addressing sexual abuse, organizations like Bishop Accountability and SNAP and others that have been represented here this weekend, are running on strapped budgets that are wildly unrepresentative of the actual economic power of the Roman Catholic Church to empower survivor-centered initiatives for change if it so chose to value them. It looks patriarchal, it looks white. Patriarchal, aside from the literal sense, because the church has not found or has not chosen to find a way to systematically empower and value survivors as its primary leaders and prophets on this issue. Patriarchal because a sophisticated analysis of gender and sexuality and hierarchy plentifully offered by many Catholic feminist theologians and others has not been made authoritative for understanding or addressing the sexual abuse crisis by decision makers. White, because the same can be said, and to a much greater degree, of analyses of race and colonization. White, because we know that people of color are at higher risk of becoming targets of abuse, and yet survivors of color are largely absent, read systemically excluded from, spaces created even by and for survivors in the US with genuine care. I invite you to take a brief look around this wonderful gift of a room. And as bad as all of this looks, and I will say again, just in case anyone missed the part where I said the situation of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church looks dire, it also looks like a scapegoat for the rest of the Christian church, in which equally severe problems flourish, but benefit from being outside the range of the US spotlight, so to speak, that is focused on the Catholic Church. The only dynamic I've named so far that is unique to the Roman Catholic Church is your community's access, with Dr. Kincaid pointed out as well, to concrete, publicly available documentation of the fact and nature of your clergy sexual abuse problem. In the rest of the Christian church, when abusive leaders are moved from congregation to congregation, all traces of evidence are destroyed. Records of survivors' reports are shredded, files go missing, hard drives are wiped. It all just, poof, magically disappears. Somewhat uniquely, you have a solid foundation of evidence and documentation, and that actually puts Catholics in a more empowered position to strategize for change. Beyond that, the sexual abuse crisis in every single Christian denomination, and it exists in all of them, looks preventable. In all of them, all across the Christian church, it looks stagnant, it looks naive, it looks underfunded and undervalued. It looks patriarchal, and in predominantly white denominations, it also looks white. I work with survivors from all across the Christian church and interface with Christian leaders and structures in many different denominations. And while there are important nuances to each context, there is another level on which it all looks the same. Sexual abuse is ubiquitous. The enablement and cover-up of abuse in Western Christianity is ubiquitous. The conscious and unconscious dynamics that perpetuate abuse are very similar from one community to the next, and survivors' experiences are very similar from one community to the next. And in this sense, the Catholic sexual abuse crisis, quite honestly, looks mundane, average, old hat. But there is opportunity here. Opportunity to increase the strategic power of Catholic networks working earnestly to address sexual abuse, like those represented here, by joining with networks in other denominations to pool resources, another point that my colleague Elizabeth made. What could we create together and accomplish together if the small number of folks committed to stopping sexual violence in each denomination shared wisdom and money and time, divvied up the work between us, and made the fruits of our labor accessible to everyone? I've already begun addressing the second question posed to our panel, but I want to turn to it now in earnest. What are the distinctive challenges that have arisen in the Christian churches to address sexual abuse, and how are these communities meeting those challenges? I've been emphasizing commonalities, and I do think that emphasis is deeply relevant for strategizing for change. But there are, of course, distinct challenges. Leaders in denominations with horizontal polity are not empowered to hold individual congregations accountable for following any of the recommendations that leaders might make regarding sexual violence. Peace churches are having a hard time coming to terms with the role that peace theology has played in enabling abuse. The Amish resist using English support systems. Conservative Protestants are stuck in gender complementarianism. Progressive Protestants resent survivors who point out that their good intentions don't automatically translate into right action. Black churches have to contend with the way that white supremacy threatens racist ramifications anytime Black men are identified as abusers in white public spaces. The transformation of cultures of sexual violence in any Christian denomination does require thoughtful attention to that context's distinct characteristics. And yet, I want to talk about strategies for stopping sexual violence and empowering survivors that my organization has found useful across the range of these different contexts. You don't want to hear me talk for the rest of the day, so I'm going to name two. First and foremost, any successful effort to address sexual abuse in the church needs to prioritize giving survivors resources so that they are as empowered as possible to make their own best decisions about how best they want to advocate for themselves, advocate for change, and how they want to live their lives in ways that build a better future. When I say give survivors resources, I mean respect, time, money, information, access to knowledge, especially the kind usually protected by gatekeepers. I mean access to high quality therapy, childcare, medication, help cleaning the house. Give survivors positions of authority in your shared communities. Give them authority over you. Give survivors everything they need to make their own informed decisions, and if they so choose, everything they need to lead resistance to sexual violence in your community without oversight. Partnership, yes. Solidarity, yes, but not oversight. There is a tendency in Christian spaces for survivors to be infantilized, to be conceived only as broken ones who are in need of healing and who are in need of being saved by the church. Yes, it is important for communities to be equipped and willing to extend care to survivors when care is requested from them. But it's equally important that we guard against developing a general image of survivors as in need of rescue, or an image of the church as a necessary agent of rescue. It is clearly the church that is in need of radical transformation. And survivors have something to offer the church in its processes of becoming well. Conceptualizing survivors primarily as broken and in need of healing from the church doesn't get us there. Survivors are prophets, anointed by God to show the church the way forward. Regarding them as anything less will keep our progress slow and partial. The priority of resourcing survivors, respecting survivors, empowering survivors, and trusting survivors to lead certainly their own lives and perhaps the life of the church is, I think, a necessary foundation for any effort to address sexual abuse in any Christian context. That's the first strategy. Above all else, above unity, above image, above conflict avoidance, above institutional survival. Prioritizing giving survivors resources so that they are as empowered as possible to make their own best decisions about how they want to advocate for themselves, advocate for change, and how they want to live their lives that build a better future. And here's the second strategy. To stop perpetrators from sexual abuse from abusing more people, you have to remove three things. First, their authority. Second, their access to vulnerable populations. And third, their good regard in communities where they are at risk of perpetrating again. Authority and access are at least somewhat straightforward. Removing a perpetrator's authority is key to stopping abuse because authority is the primary currency abusers rely on to abuse and get away with it. Removing a perpetrator's authority means revoking their clergy status of abusers who are priests and pastors, revoking the licensure of abusers who are mental health workers. It also means using symbolic and social action to restructure the power relationship between that person and the community in which they used to hold authority. So for example, going back to the Haas case as a point of reference, this is what GIA Publishing did when they announced publicly their decision to stop publishing Haas's music and then contacted all of the dioceses in the country to make sure that their position was heard. A restructuring of the power relationship in the community. By removing a perpetrator's access to vulnerable populations, or rather, this removal of access to vulnerable populations is key for stopping abuse because access is 9/10 of sexual violence. If possession is 9/10 of the law, access is 9/10 of sexual violence. Decreasing access decreases a perpetrator's opportunities to abuse. We can hope that a perpetrator of sexual violence will repent and change their ways, but we cannot count on it. So we take measures to make sure that a perpetrator who has abused children is never around children. A perpetrator who has abused people under their religious care is never again in a position to have people under their religious care. A perpetrator who has abused students is never again in charge of a classroom. A perpetrator who has abused their clients is never again in a position to have clients. That's what it looks like to remove access. Removing authority and removing access can be controversial, but I find that the third recommendation is where Christians tend to struggle the most. Remove a perpetrator's good regard in communities at risk of enabling them. When I say remove good regard, I don't mean announce this person as unloved by God. I don't mean to cease treating them with the kind of dignity owed to all of God's creation. I mean, cease extending them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to their ethical character. Withdraw trust in proportion to the extent that the perpetrator has broken trust. Keep the fact of the harm they have caused and the needs of their survivors at the forefront of your mind as you struggle to figure out what treating them with dignity means in the wake of their unacceptably violent and manipulative behavior. And don't just do this individually. Cultivate this stance in the communities where it is at all possible that the perpetrator might try to abuse again. Removing a perpetrator's good regard is critical for stopping abuse because sexual abuse is not only an interpersonal event between two individuals. It takes an entire community to enable abuse. Revelations of abuse impact every member, and it takes an entire community with eyes wide open to prevent abuse from happening again. I'm going to stop here and summarize. From the specific locations where I stand, a clergy sexual abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church looks bad. It also looks bad in every other part of the Christian church in the US. While it is important to tend to contextual specifics, abuse across the whole of the Christian church is quite similar. And two strategies we have found useful for addressing sexual abuse in any Christian context. One, prioritizing giving survivors resources so that they are as empowered as possible to make their own best decisions about how they want to advocate for themselves, advocate for change, and how they want to live their lives in ways that build a better future. And two, stop perpetrators from sexually abusing more people by removing their authority, access, and good regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hillary. Our third and final speaker for the panel this morning is Mark Ruzian, who is lecturer in liturgical studies at Yale Institute of Sacred Music and Yale Divinity School. He received his PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame in 2019. His research focuses on the theology and worship of early and Eastern Christians. He is an ordained deacon in the Orthodox Church in America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruzian.
Well, thanks everybody. And I want to especially thank Kim and David for inviting me to this panel. I feel very humbled by the sort of august company of my panelists and the expertise represented here. So I really appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to talk with you all. Maybe I should say a little bit about me and my approach before I talk about my topic today. My research tends towards the historical and theological. I'm really interested in particularly how religious communities respond to crisis situations. And my work has mostly focused on ecological crisis, but I'm interested in responses to other kinds of crises as well. I'm speaking from an ecclesial position in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. But I really resonate with the comments of my colleagues in saying that for us, the sex abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church has given us an opportunity to be complacent and to treat it as a scapegoat and to ignore the problems within our own tradition and our own communities in the United States, but also around the world. So I just want to put that out there for now. I'm going to put up a little PowerPoint since my presentation has a few parts, just so everyone can follow along better. Again, given my own sort of research proclivities, my presentation is going to tend towards the theological and the historical. So bear with me. And I know we will get it to the end towards more practical issues by the end of the paper. So I've given a title to my comments today as well: Spiritual Abuse in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Confession, Guruism, and Hierarchy. So I'll begin. Abuse can take different forms in the church. There's physical and sexual abuse, there's psychological abuse, and there's something called spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse can be defined as the use of faith and belief to coerce another person. Often these three forms of abuse are intertwined. Sexual abuse in church spaces very often takes place within the larger context of psychological and spiritual abuse. So as we seek ways of healing and building trust, we need to address each of these pernicious vectors of abuse. So in my presentation this morning, I'd like to focus on spiritual abuse. And I'm going to look at the phenomenon as it manifests in my own ecclesial tradition of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And I hope that some of the issues I raise will be recognizable and illuminating to the Roman Catholics in our midst and the other faith traditions represented here. Let me just give you a brief refresher on this faith tradition. The Orthodox Christian tradition emerged, broadly speaking, from Greek-speaking Christians in the eastern parts of the Roman Empire. In the first 1,000 years of church history, Greek and Latin Christian traditions coexisted in communion with one another, but went their own separate ways in the Middle Ages. And today, most Eastern Orthodox Christians reside in places such as Greece, Serbia, Ukraine, Russia, and with significant communities in Europe, Australia, and the US, as you can see on this map. The Orthodox Church shares many similarities with Catholicism. To name a few relevant ones here, it features a hierarchical church structure ruled by bishops. It foregrounds baptism and Eucharist as privileged modes of communion with God and other people, and it retains the practice of private confession of sins, which I will focus on a lot in this presentation. Repentance, or in Greek metanoia, is seen as the primary mode of life in Orthodox Christianity. Metanoia is a rich and expansive term that means change of mind or change of heart, and is understood to touch all aspects of a believer's life. Metanoia can take many forms, but one of its forms is the practice of private confession of sins to a priest or a spiritual mentor. The modern practice of formal confession of sins in Eastern Orthodox Christianity is similar to Roman Catholicism, but there are important differences as well. Due to its distinctive practice and theology of confession, Eastern Orthodoxy is particularly susceptible to the phenomenon of guruism. And by guruism, I mean the tendency to revere certain individuals as absolute authorities in religious belief and practice. Guruism is somewhat widespread in Orthodox Christianity and creates an environment for spiritual, sexual, and other kinds of abuse. By homing in on guruism, especially as it relates to the practice of confession, I hope to uncover some of the deeper issues related to spiritual abuse, and then begin to identify a framework for accurately naming and diagnosing it. So let me just give a brief historical background about the practice of confession in Orthodox Christianity. The practice of auricular confession of sins originated in the early centuries of the church, and it was linked to this troubling question connected to baptism. The question was this: if baptism affects the forgiveness of sins and is a one-time event, then how to deal with serious sins committed after baptism? How will people find forgiveness and reconciliation with God and the community? Evidence suggests that early Greek-speaking Christians, the predecessors of Eastern Orthodoxy, approached the issue of post-baptismal sin in a somewhat different way than their Latin-speaking co-religionists. The 3rd century North African writer, Latin writer Tertullian describes a practice of public confession. A person who has committed a serious sin after baptism would stand before the community and confess their sins to everyone present. They asked for the community's prayers and forgiveness and spent time, sometimes even years, fasting, wearing sackcloth and ashes, and abstaining from the Eucharist. And finally, after a period of public repentance was over, the individual would return to full participation in community life and reception of the Eucharist. So for Tertullian and early Latin-speaking Christianity, the practice of confession was public. Its purpose was reconciliation with God and community. Early Greek-speaking Christians took a somewhat different approach. Here we see less emphasis on public confession and more on private mentorship with a wise teacher. Persons who sinned were encouraged to discuss their problems and sins with a learned elder who could advise them on the proper remedies for overcoming them. There's a theological dimension behind this practice. In Greek Christianity, sin is generally viewed more as an illness rather than a transgression of law. Thus, the purpose of confession was not to make one right before the law, but to undergo a kind of therapy to make the person healthy and able to be reconciled with God and the community. Though outwardly different from the public practice of confession among Latin Christians, the point of private confession in early Greek-speaking Christianity was the same: to reconcile the person with God and community, which was consummated through the sharing of the Eucharist. This mentor-mentee relationship we see in early Greek Christianity evolved and changed, especially within monastic settings. Beginning in the early Middle Ages, monastic leaders increasingly emphasized the importance of obedience to a spiritual father or a spiritual mother, that is, the wise elder. The task of the average monk or nun was to completely relinquish their will to the spiritual elder, confessing all their thoughts and sins, and receive detailed instructions on the spiritual life, prayer, and conflict resolution with other members of the monastery. And for their part, spiritual fathers and mothers were called to dedicate their lives completely to their spiritual children, and were even thought to be responsible for their sins on the final judgment day. The importance of obedience to the spiritual father or mother was paramount in medieval Orthodox monasticism and was formulated specifically for monastic life, not parish life. Here I want to highlight an important point. The spiritual father or mother did not need to be an ordained priest or bishop. A spiritual father could be a simple monk, nun, or even a pious male or female layperson. Some of these laypersons or lay monks were even given the authority to formally grant absolution from sins. Spiritual elders are sometimes called spirit bearers and have been important and very positive sources in the life of the church. Spiritual eldership has provided opportunities for both men and women to use their spiritual gifts outside of official clerical channels of church structure. So the authority vested in these holy women and men effectively sets up two streams of authority in the Orthodox Church, two streams of hierarchy even. There's clerical authority and hierarchy, meaning priests and bishops, and then there's charismatic authority and hierarchy, which does not necessitate ordination. The dialectical tension between clerical hierarchy and charismatic hierarchy has been a driving force in the history of the Orthodox Church and continues to this very day. Slowly, beginning in the late Middle Ages and modern period, this practice of spiritual eldership moved beyond the walls of the monastery. Faced with difficult historical circumstances in many majority Orthodox territories, the Orthodox Church experienced a monasticization. Practices created by and for monasteries started to become expected for everyday believers in parish churches. These practices included extended periods of fasting and long rules for private prayer, and most importantly, the role of the spiritual elder also became very important for laypersons. As I've discussed, the Orthodox Christian notion of confession always emphasized this personal mentor-mentee relationship between the spiritual father or mother and the believer. That never changed. But what monasticization did change for the average lay believer were expectations placed on that relationship. In particular, the demand for absolute obedience, which was perhaps more appropriate in a monastic setting, came into the everyday parish setting. And unlike the early church, where reconciliation with God and community was the ultimate goal of spiritual direction, here the goal of confession was transformed into spiritual improvement under a qualified guide. The way this often takes shape today is that believers will search for the most qualified spiritual elder, usually a seemingly holy person, and not the parish priest in their local community. What are the criteria for one's search for a right spiritual father or mother? There are none. So in reality, it often happens that spiritual directors will be chosen based on their reputation from networks of disciples or just hearsay, without any vetting or accountability. This phenomenon has, of course, benefits and potential dangers. There really are wonderful, wise guides experienced in the spiritual life who can have a positive influence on their disciples. I know many people who have had a special relationship with a spiritual father or mother, and that relationship has enriched their lives immensely. Unfortunately, I'm also aware of the opposite situation. Too many times I've heard stories of individuals entering into a relationship with a spiritual father or mother who will demand absolute obedience from them. Soon they will have to ask their spiritual father for a blessing for everyday things like having a friend over for dinner or buying a camera. All the details of their lives come under the control of the elder. The elder tells them when they should have kids, what job they should pursue. They might even scrutinize their sex lives with their spouse, etc. In many cases, disciples crave this kind of authority over their life to bring them a sense of order and direction, but the relationship sometimes crosses a line into spiritual abuse and other forms of abuse, including sexual abuse. Here's where we encounter this phenomenon of guruism. Orthodox Christian gurus, taking to the extreme the traditions of spiritual direction created for monastic life, demand a toxic mixture of two dangerous ingredients: absolute obedience and absolute loyalty. By giving their spiritual father or mother control over all their decisions, disciples enter into an utterly asymmetrical relationship, making themselves extremely vulnerable. Gurus tell their disciples that they cannot see anyone else for spiritual advice, and that if they break off their relationship, they'll be excommunicated on the path to damnation. Notice how the guru occupies the role traditionally ascribed to the church as a whole. It's normally the church and its community and sacramental life where Orthodox Christians find healing and reconciliation and grace. But now the guru assumes that role in the person's life. Disciples of gurus who seek to flee abusive situations often wait in a state of limbo, fearful and unsure of their spiritual status. Many Orthodox clergy believe that the authority of a spiritual father is indeed binding in some sense, and thus hesitate to interfere in that relationship even when asked. As a result, victims often languish and suffer deep emotional trauma in extended periods of non-resolution, and many simply leave the church. Excommunication, threats, shaming, these are the tools of Orthodox gurus. Let me just mention two recent cases of guruism that have led to spiritual and other kinds of abuse. An Orthodox priest in the northern United States was in charge of an academy for quote-unquote at-risk high school boys. Like many such reform schools, this school had strict policies for behavior and had the added twist of Orthodox spirituality. But what that meant was the school centered exclusively around the priest himself as both the headmaster and spiritual father. In 2015, allegations of physical, psychological, and spiritual abuse were leveled against the priest. He was taken to spiritual court and defrocked by his ruling bishop and is no longer a priest. Yet he was not excommunicated and continues to run the school. And he continues to refer to himself as Father so-and-so, cultivating a cult of personality around himself. Since the original allegations, over a dozen survivors have shared their stories of abuse at the hands of this former priest. And they describe the school as a cult led by a guru, and are frustrated by the failure of bishops to fully resolve the situation and protect potential future victims of abuse. Another recent example of guruism is a well-known network of monasteries in the United States founded by a monk who formerly lived on the famous Mount Athos in Greece, which is the spiritual and monastic center of Orthodox Christianity. This monk and his followers are well known for their obsession with the occult, virulently anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, and constant discussion of Satan and demons. These themes appeal to a certain portion of Orthodox Christians, especially wealthy ones seeking an elite spiritual network, and it draws them to their monasteries. Some of the monasteries' leaders demand from laypersons the kind of obedience and loyalty they expect from monks and nuns in their charge. Sometimes they advise laypersons to openly violate the policies and practices of their local parish communities or dioceses if they view them as insufficiently spiritual or too worldly. In addition to extra fasting and ascetic exercises, there are unverified but believable reports of spouses being directed to live together as, quote, brother and sister, that is, to abstain from sexual relations. And this has reportedly led to all kinds of marital problems, divorces, etc. As a result of all these problems, which revolve all around guruism, many of these monasteries have uneasy relationships with their local diocesan bishops who vainly try to temper their influence in parish life. These two examples show the extent to which guruism and spiritual abuse in Orthodox Christianity are not simply issues of clergy per se. Recall the medieval distinction between two kinds of authority and hierarchy, clerical and charismatic. These two streams continue in Orthodox Christianity. At their best, they balance each other out, but there's always a danger of taking either one too far. Ironically, perhaps, today it often turns out to be the clerical authorities who moderate the dangerous guruism manifest in some charismatic spaces. While the Orthodox Church has taken some positive strides in recent years to address abuse and protect victims and survivors, I believe that the church has yet to adequately diagnose the problem of spiritual abuse and its connection to guruism, from which leads all kinds of other forms of abuse, including sexual abuse. So by way of conclusion, I want to propose a distinction to better aid such a diagnosis. Many experts have identified clericalism as a primary factor in the sex abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church. As I've shown, spiritual abuse, at least in Orthodox Christianity, can also take place outside of official clerical structures. So perhaps clericalism is not the best category for addressing the problem of spiritual abuse. In an article published in the most recent issue of the journal Theological Studies, the Jesuit theologian and ethicist James Keenan outlines a concept of hierarchicalism in the context of the clergy sex abuse crisis. Hierarchicalism, as opposed to clericalism, is, quote, a much more distinctive, protected, and powerful culture that has generated many of the contemporary problems in the church, especially abuse. Keenan uses hierarchicalism primarily as a term to talk about problems in the culture of bishops, pointing in particular to examples in which bishops have covered up or tacitly approved of sex abuse by priests. He writes, quote, hierarchy has a culture. When and where it is vicious in its elitism, power, networking capability, and impunity is precisely what I mean by hierarchicalism. Keenan's definition of hierarchicalism, with a few nuances, can be helpful for diagnosing the problem behind spiritual abuse in Orthodoxy as well. I think his definition of hierarchicalism fits not only in naming when the culture of bishops becomes toxic, but also the culture of spiritual gurus as well. They too operate within an elitist network, traffic with powerful church actors, and lack accountability and transparency. I take seriously the claim that charismatic authorities in Orthodox Christianity do comprise a real source of hierarchy and authority in dialectical tension with the church's ordained priests and bishops, and sometimes these two streams overlap. What I want to claim then is that the problem of guruism in Orthodoxy is precisely the problem of hierarchicalism, in the sense that it represents an idolatrous deification of the office of the spiritual elder and distorts their true task, which is to walk alongside their spiritual children, bearing their burdens in an act of radical kenosis or self-emptying. True hierarchy, as the Orthodox theologian Alexander Golitsyn says, resides not in rank or status, but in, quote, the experience of God through the keeping of the commandments, especially the commandment of love. That is, the shepherd's total gift of self for the flock. Self-gift and not spiritual control is the mark of authentic hierarchy. And just as ordained hierarchs, bishops and priests can abuse their great responsibilities, so too can those charismatic hierarchs endowed with the ministry of intimate care for spiritual children. So to conclude, while the Orthodox Church too experiences a systemic level of sexual abuse, although perhaps not to the extent witnessed in Roman Catholicism, at least not publicly in recent decades, it has its own structures that provide avenues for abusers. The quasi-institution of the spiritual elder, an institution that has done much good for the church, can also be taken over by gurus. The networks of spiritual gurus and so-called holy men is analogous to church hierarchs. It possesses elitism, power, impunity, the very aspects of hierarchicalism that take a good thing and twist it into a perverted one. What is needed to combat the hierarchicalism that lurks behind abuse in the church, I suggest, is not only transparency and accountability on the part of those authorities, although that, of course, that is extremely important, but also a regrounding and reimagination of these forms of ministry in the image of God, whose own ministry is self-emptying, compassion, healing, and walking beside his beloved children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rusian. It's now time for us to enter into a period of discussion. So I would invite those who are present to come forward to the microphone and to ask your questions. The reason for that is so that those who are joining us remotely may hear the question that you are posing. And those who are with us remotely, if you have any questions to pose or comments to make, please communicate those And we'll make sure that those get posed to the group. So. No.
Thank you. And thank you again. I really think it's so important that we as Catholics kind of hear from voices outside of our little Catholic bubble. So I really, really appreciate that from all of you. I have picked up the same issue of that the situation is bad in not only the Catholic Church, but in so many other religious contexts. I'm wondering if any of you, and I know Hillary that you do a lot of work in a variety of particular situations in various religious contexts. I'm wondering if you can speak to any place that you have seen that is doing this well, even if it's on a small scale, a particular congregation, for example. I think of, especially, I appreciated what you said about the sense of urgency that survivors bring to the table and how many of us are lacking that. And I'm just wondering if anybody from other areas of the Christian world you think has responded well in some way that we could learn from.
Great question. The easiest answer is no. Well, in the sense that I genuinely do not have an example of a survivor going to a community asking for accountability and solidarity, and that community responding in a way that did not further traumatize that survivor. However, I do have plenty of relationships with and examples of instances in which religious leaders are thinking proactively and engaging other kinds of situations in their churches with really impressive mindfulness. So just to make that concrete, one example is that there's a small church where the pastor of the church had a conversation with a longtime member, not clergy, just a longtime respected, important member of the congregation who came forward privately to her and said, I need to confess that when I was doing missionary work in Africa, X number of years ago, I sexually abused boys. 3. And it was clear that he wanted her forgiveness. She called our organization into account and asked to consult. Just said, what do I do? What can you help me think through a survivor-centered way of fulfilling my role as minister in the wake of this particular context? So we worked with her, and what she ended up doing was going back and saying to this member of her congregation, it's right that you came forward and said this. If you want to pursue forgiveness and reconciliation, if you want to be accountable for your actions and take the next right step, then the next step is for me to get in touch with the organization that you were serving with when you perpetrated this abuse, let them know, and for us to go look for the survivors and find out what they would need from us as a religious community in order to be in accountable relationship with you. That was not the answer that he was looking for. But I offer that example as one that comes immediately to mind, where a community sought out a survivor-centered response to a complicated disclosure of abuse and followed through in a really impressive way.
I also want to thank you all for what you've offered. It's a lot to think about. The question was posed, what would it look like if we were to pool our resources? And so I'm wondering, what would it look like if we were to pool our resources? Specifically, like if you can give us some things that we could latch on to. Thank you. What comes to mind for me as a first step would be to locate the different survivor-centered organizations that are serving different communities. And I say survivor-centered because not all organizations that deal with sexual abuse do so in a survivor-centered way. There are a lot of organizations that deal with sexual abuse that end up exacerbating the problem. So locating survivor-centered groups of people who are addressing abuse in Anglican contexts, in Orthodox contexts, in Mennonite, et cetera, and building relationships between those folks doing that work. I think getting those people together to talk about common problems and common needs, I expect that what we would find is that the common needs are actually common across those organizations and groups. And so then rather than having 20 groups trying to address 20 problems, you could assign one need for a resource creation, right? Or one need for developing a certain kind of policy to each of those groups, and then do them really well, and then bring all of that work back together to share with everyone. That's the kind of process I have in mind.
I've got another thought on the education side. Can y'all see me?
Yes.
Oh, great. So I've got another thought as someone who's been involved in education of both Anglican and Roman Catholic seminarians. I think I think Hillary's approach is the most important. I think a supplemental education approach is for us to do a better job with church leaders, particularly ordained church leaders, talking to each other and moving towards mutual responsibility and ownership. I think that will lead to some softening of hearts and more openness to hearing what, for example, these survivor-centered groups are advocating. For example, I know of a bishop in the Episcopal Church who, if he has a priest or seminarian who's thinking about becoming Roman Catholic, makes them read the report from the Diocese of Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, whichever one it is, which is such an antagonistic place to start, as opposed to creating opportunity. I mean, trying to get them not to become Roman Catholic, sort of like this is their problem, it's not our problem. But whereas creating opportunities for more with seminarians, with priests, with bishops, with lay leaders coming together and having discussions that result in mutual accountability. I think that would just create the mutual accountability would create more space to listen to the voices of survivors.
Just to return to one of the points that Dr. Royson brought up in his presentation about charismatic leadership. I think there are clamorous examples in the history of the Catholic Church of charismatic leaders perpetrating abuse for years and years. Are there efforts among different Christian communities in formation or in response to that kind of abuse perpetrated by charismatic leaders? So first of all, is there anything effort in formation to balance the charisma that is needed to be an effective minister with the charismatic leadership that can often turn into either spiritual or sexual abuse? And if so, are there lessons that can be shared with Roman Catholic Church, the Catholic Church in general, regarding formation and response to charismatic leadership in particular, and then spiritual and sexual abuse that can stem from that so often?
Maybe I can speak first on this. Disappointingly, there really hasn't been any sufficient way of addressing the problems of abuse by charismatic authorities in Orthodoxy. And when there are attempts to kind of crack down or, steer people away from these kinds of situations, is almost always post hoc. It's almost always after an abuse has taken place. And it tends to simply shift the balance of power over to the bishops. And it doesn't always create a solution. In fact, it sometimes just creates different kinds of problems in the church. So I would be really interested to know from my colleagues here on the panel if you have any insight into this question, because I feel very much at a loss here in Orthodox Christianity to know what to do. Because as I said, there's simply no accountability for these actors. There's no process of vetting. There's no, they tend to fly under the radar of any kind of authority, whether it's from bishops or fellow monks or priests or whoever. So it's very hard to get a handle on this kind of thing.
I would say there are many attempts, many formational attempts, lots of conscious efforts. I don't know how to evaluate how successful they are, but that would be an interesting study. But I do think that one thing that is desperately needed in seminaries that I am in relation to is a way to end the seminary process and education for a person who is deemed to be on that kind of track. Right now in Protestant seminaries or ecumenical, denominationally non-connected seminaries, it is really, really hard not to put a person who begins a program through to the end of the program. And yes, seminary education is not the same as ordination, but a person with seminary credentials is as good as authoritative in many settings. So seminaries have a role to play in guarding against solidifying a certain kind of educational authority for people who are developing in the direction of charismatic leader in an abusive manner. But we don't have policies. We don't have words on paper. Like faculty in the room or spiritual advisors don't have anything to turn to that says, this is how you know when you're dealing with somebody in this way. And here are the criteria by which you have authority to sanction or put on probation or remove a person from the program, from the ability of actually attaining these credentials. And it turns into a legal problem. So when you're trying to deal with somebody, especially somebody who is developing manipulative tendencies, which usually go along with charismatic tendencies, I find those folks particularly willing to use and manipulate all of the policies that a school does have in place to their benefit. So we need documents and policies written that empower institutions of education and formation to actually stop the process at a certain point when they deem it necessary.
This is not directly to speak to the question, but to note something that is relevant for both charismatic, lay, and clerical leadership. And it's to recognize that, it's not simply the church. This is a culture-wide problem. It occurs in business, it occurs in athletics, it occurs in the home, it occurs in universities. And all people who are in a religious, in any kind of leadership position, especially interacting with young people, need to have their antenna up that problems are likely occurring, not simply in the church, but in other forms. And this was brought home to me in the most uncomfortable jury that I ever served on. I'm usually the kind of juror that attorneys don't want. I'm a university professor. I ask lots of questions. I have to be convinced of things. So I usually get quickly dismissed. But this was a trial that centered on incest. And I ended up serving on it. It involved a half brother and sister. So a mixed marriage. The abuse started when the boy was 16 and the girl was 8. It continued throughout the time until she graduated from high school. And finally, at some youth event, the context was such that she just broke down and confessed. And the youth leader, I have no idea what particular faith tradition this was a part of, but the faith leader had enough sense to take her immediately to the authorities and file a complaint. And to make a long story short, what happened also explained why the abuse had gone on for so long. As soon as it was reported, the mother disinherited the daughter, not the son who had done this, feeling that he had brought shame on the family. We eventually convicted the person at the trial. This was Florida state law, and Florida state law only allowed 1 count of statutory rape for every year that the abuse had taken place. And so that was all that we were permitted to do. But it drove home to me the awareness that the young people that we are dealing with in particular, there are so many contexts in which abuse can happen. And we need to be attentive to the needs that they will have and try to do the best that we can to provide the kind of help and resources that they need to navigate those very difficult and precarious situations. David, how are we doing on time?
We're a bit over time, so unless there are any other questions.
Thank you again, and please join me in expressing our gratitude to the panel.